All right, so welcome to week 2 of the poetry lecture, part 2. Now, as you've been able to determine that graveyard poetry is somewhat of a misnomer, or at least it doesn't end up being what it says on the tin. Some people expect it to be spooky stuff, and I guess it can be, but there's no like zombies or anything like that. So we're not talking about like our modern Halloween interpretation of graveyards. So graveyard or churchyard poets, they normally evoke and kind of toy with certain imagery, the first being graveyards and churchyards. That's a surprise. But they also talk a lot about night and sleep. So you might have noticed in some of the poems you've been reading for this week, night and sleep, which is another theme of graveyard poetry. Anyone else want to venture to guess any others that one might find in your typical graveyard churchyard poets?
Nature.
Nature, good. I'll get into that. It's not the next one on my bullet point, so I can't reveal it like I would. It often talks about winter, which is part of nature, leafless tree branches, and snuggly interiors, which you'll see in the task. What do these images and what do these kind of settings and topics kind of have in common? And why would a graveyard poet seem to feel comfortable discussing these particular topics or these particular settings, scenes, themes?
I mean, winter's cold like death, and it's the end of the year, like the end of life.
Oh, excellent. So winter is actually a stand-in for death as much as the graveyard might be. So when winter comes, so we live, I think, a little bit, maybe for those in the Southwest anyway, Christy might be a little bit different, but people in the Southwest forget to what extent winter is evocative of death, because we live in a fairly unseasoned climate. But in Europe, for instance, winter was always seen as a time of death. Nothing grew, the ground froze, the trees, the deciduous trees dropped their leaves, and everything seemed very skeletal and lifeless for several months out of the year. So of course, any poet would look around and say, okay, this is reminding me of death. And then of course, the antithesis of that is when nature would kind of wake up again. Oh, I just gave away the game for the next one about sleep. But when nature would kind of come back to life in the springtime, then life would be reborn. There would be this kind of perennial cycle, these cycles of life and death. And so winter evoked death just as much as a graveyard did. And so the graveyard poets weren't necessarily they didn't always have to write about graveyards, right? Just so you know, like they wrote about other kinds of equivalencies, winter, and then the other one being sleep. And all three of these things evoke death or that which interrupts normal, mundane, quotidian activity. So in the winter, you couldn't plow your field anymore. It was sometimes icy. At night, everyone went to sleep. No one was out. No one was doing anything. So it gave that pause. It gave that moment to reflect on life. So reflection being the next one. And then night and sleep anyway give you the opportunity to get into dreams, the irrational and the unknown, which was another graveyard poet's concern. And we will see examples of that as we go. So these are our kind of main poets of the course. Last week we discussed the ones in white mainly. This week we will mainly be discussing the ones in yellow, but there will be some overlap. But as you can see, it's kind of evenly divided between those that were born in the 17th century and those that were born in the 18th century. And the strange thing that you'll see also is that Edward Young, who's born quite early, was quite late in the game he became famous as a poet in his 50s, in his late 50s. So Edward Young, contrary to his name, became famous by his writing, his poetry, that finally he kind of found his voice, as it were. Even though James Thomson was much younger, he came first, and Edward Young kind of rose on the wave of blank verse that James Thomson kind of initiated or instigated. And most of the poets that we will be looking at in this week's lecture wrote in blank verse. So James Thomson, there's actually another James Thomson. So if you're ever looking up James Thomson online and you want to do research, unfortunately for you, there's another James Thomson who was also a poet, who was also Scottish, who also wrote about kind of dark melancholy themes. So make sure you have the right James Thomson if you're doing research on James Thomson. I actually did a lot of research on the other James Thomson, who is more of a 19th century figure. They're both good poets, I think. But his Winter was first published in quite early, as in terms of these poems that we're going to be looking at that are all in blank verse. He kind of started a trend of blank verse. As yet, 'tis midnight deep, the weary clouds, slow meeting, mingle into solid gloom. Now, while the drowsy world lies lost in sleep, let me associate with the serious night and contemplation, her sedate compeer. Let me shake off the intrusive cares of day and lay the meddling senses all aside. Where now, ye lying vanities of life, ye ever tempting, ever cheating train? Where are you now? And what is your amount? Vexation, disappointment, and remorse, sad, sickening thought, and yet deluded man, a scene of crude, disjointed visions past, and broken slumbers rises still resolved with new flushed hopes to run the giddy round. So this poem starts off at midnight, and it is about his contemplation that ensues by being kind of the only one awake while everyone else is lost in sleep. Him being awake while everyone else is asleep gives him the opportunity and the means and the subject matter to reflect on his kind of almost insomniac position, looking at the sleepers in the world and reflecting on life, much as one would reflect on life going through a churchyard. Whereas in the daytime, you're kind of just caught up in the moment and the busyness and the duties of the day. And he ends up coming to this kind of moment where he says, Father of light and life, thou good supreme, oh, teach me what is good. Teach me thyself, save me from folly, vanity, and vice, from every low pursuit, and feed my soul with knowledge, conscious peace and virtue pure, sacred, substantial, never fading bliss. Does anyone want to make any comments about what's going on here between these three? They're not really stanzas because it's blank verse, but it's not organized through rhyme, but they're just kind of three clumps of text, I guess you could say. Anyone want to chime in? And
Yeah,
anyone
I
notice?
noticed that there's a pretty similar logic structure, at least between him and like the Robert Blair poem, where they're kind of like sitting in that dark corner with scotch and meditating on life and all those elements. But then at the end, toward the end of the poem, they kind of use all those dark thoughts to elevate God, like man is such like this small thing. And then usually in those final stanzas, they're like, oh yeah, because man is so small, because I am so insignificant, I should kneel. And it's kind of like the same thing. Like if these graveyard poets were to look up at the stars, they would describe the stars instead of graveyard as reminding how insignificant they are. And because of that, the logic of these poems tends to be like, oh, I should kneel because I'm so insignificant.
That's good. Good. Anyone want to add anything else? Yeah. As Paul kind of pointed out, there's a bit of an antithetical or almost paradoxical situation where you're sowing here anyway. He's in darkness. He seeks out darkness, and the darkness is the means through which he comes to this realization of light. So if he didn't go, it's like, it kind of reminds me of that cheesy saying, like, I think it's a U2 lyric, actually, midnight is where the day begins or something. But it's like, when things are at their darkest, things can only get better. You have to go through darkness to appreciate or see the light or something. I don't know if that's necessarily what he had in mind here, but it's kind of interesting that you see this in this poem and in others, this enlightenment. I don't want to talk about it in terms of enlightenment because that confuses you with the Enlightenment, but there is a certain kind of enlightenment going on that can only be arrived at through an appreciation of and a going through of darkness or death, or the reflection that pondering death, mortality, dark kind of lends itself to. Okay, this is something I noticed, and you'll actually notice it in several poems as we go. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, I'm sure by now you kind of all have this already under your belt, but blank verse is to be contrasted clearly with the Pope couplets that came before. It has a strict meter, but it has no rhyme scheme. And then traditionally in English poetry, it's in iambic pentameter. I don't know if you remember what an iambic pentameter is. Pentameter is a reference to the word pent is 5. But if you look, it has 10 syllables. A line of pentameter has 10 syllables. So the pent is not referring to this number of syllables. It's referring to the number of iambs. And an iamb is a 2-syllable kind of structure, usually dun-dun. So da-dun, 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 da-dun. That is an iambic pentameter. That's just how to count meter. And believe it or not, there were some reasons that this was popular and kind of, it came and went. I mean, it was obviously popular under Milton and in Shakespeare. You get a lot of blank verse. And then it was kind of no longer in fashion for a while during Pope. And then it came back under the Romantics and the later graveyard poets. Why do you think that is? Why do you think blank verse is used in some of these cases? Why use blank verse? Or why use any form of poetry?
I think blank verse it's traditionally said that it most resembles what human speech is. And so if you're trying to get away from that very formal Augustan kind of structure where this is being handed down to you and everything is ordered, this is more of a natural way of speaking.
It can be very chatty. You're right. It can be. It's easier to write in because you're not forced to rhyme, first of all. And believe it or not, like English naturally falls into, I have a very interesting kind of anecdote, and it would take a while to tell. Someday I'll tell this anecdote, but I have an anecdote about how English sounds kind of like dun 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 to foreign ears, whereas other languages, and this is part of the anecdote. And again, I won't get into it, but I've had some friends from Japan who, I guess I am kind of getting into it, but like when they're trying to mimic English, Japanese people will say da dun da dun da dun da dun da dun. And I always thought that's kind of strange because when as a child, when I would kind of pretend to be speaking Japanese, I would not do that. So languages have a certain character, and I think iambic meter fits English well, and it feels very natural for English to be in that. However, go ahead.
Yeah, can I ask you a question about the two poets that we had this week, Blair and Young, and their use of iambic pentameter?
Sure.
Blair seems to do a lot better, frankly. I mean, I think it flows more easily what he's saying, and he sticks to iambic pentameter. And so I read him first, and then I read Young after that, and I got out a fluorescent orange marker, and I couldn't help but just notice all these places where he just says, well, it was too hard to find it to say what I wanted to say and keep it in meter. So I did something else.
Wow. Yeah. I think a lot of that you're when you're getting confused or when it's a little bit hard to digest, I think that's the influence of Milton, because Milton was actually using iambic pentameter, or I'm sorry, blank verse, in order to try to seem like Horace or Roman poetry. And Roman poetry or Latin poetry, you can mess up you can switch around the order of the words
Yeah.
forever, and the meaning won't change, because you know, a word will be an object or a subject based on the end of the word rather than the order of the word as in English. So I think Milton was, I think this is written somewhere in one of your lectures, but Milton was trying to mimic that kind of style.
Well,
And
and then
so
Young was trying to imitate Milton.
exactly. So some of these earlier adopters, when I say earlier, I mean 18th century earlier, those in the 18th century who started adopting blank verse were just trying to be like Milton. And so it sounded very Miltonic. And in some senses it was, they were very self-conscious of that. And they actually were trying to do that for effect, or because they like Milton. He still had quite a high profile. But later, and in this lecture, actually, we're going to be talking about Cowper or Cooper, the poet, for next week. And he has an extremely conversational blank verse style. And he's praised for that. And the romantic poets like Wordsworth loved Cooper for his chatty poetry, and it was all in blank verse. So he was able to do what you said, like kind of make it a little bit more, a little bit almost like less like poetry, chatty, and much more digestible or approachable. So let's look at Young. Now, Young, as I said, he tried for many years to write like Pope, and then at some point in his 50s, he decided, well, maybe I'll try my hand at some blank verse. And he actually ended up being pretty good at it. So he found his voice. And he also is writing about night. And if you read this, like you said, it is very much like Milton. He's doing these allusions or apostrophes to the goddess, as you find in Latin, in Roman era classical poetry, in Virgil. So night, sable goddess, from her ebon throne in rayless majesty, now stretches forth her leaden scepter, or a slumbering world, silence, now dead in darkness, how profound, how dead in darkness, how profound. Nor eye nor listening ear an object finds. Creation sleeps. 'Tis as the general pulse of life stood still, and nature made a pause, an awful pause, and by that they mean awesome. They used to call awesome awful. Prophetic of her end. And let her prophecy still soon fulfilled. Fate, drop the curtain. I can lose no more. Silence and darkness, solemn sisters, twins from ancient night, whose nurse the tender thought to reason, and on reason build resolve. That column of true majesty in man, assist me. I will thank you in the grave, your kingdom. There this frame shall fall a victim sacred to your dreary shrine. But what are ye? So all this is an apostrophe speaking to night, a goddess night. And this night takes almost this twin or dual nature of silence and darkness. Thou who didst put to flight primeval silence, when the morning stars, exulting, shouted o'er the rising ball, O thou, whose word from solid darkness struck that spark, the sun, strike wisdom from my soul which flies to thee, her trust, her treasure, as misers to their gold, while others rest through this opaque of nature and of soul, this double night, transmit one pitying ray to lighten and to cheer. Oh, lead my mind, a mind that fain would wander from its woe. Do you recognize any similarities with what is being talked about here with the poem we looked at, the Thomson Winter? Any kind of similar rhetoric or paradigm that is evoked here? As you found in Thomson, he's going through darkness while others are asleep. And by his kind of reflecting at night, he finds enlightenment of a kind. That middle line in the middle of the blue section, this double night, so it's a double night, those twin sisters, transmit one pitying ray. So it's almost like a kind of alchemy where you put these two dark things together and you get a one ray of light that comes out of it to lighten and to cheer. So there's an alchemical process through by which you go through the dark and golden rays of light and cheer kind of come out into your reflecting head by virtue of your reflecting in the nighttime, as happened in the Thomson poem.
And I think I'm right that the Thomson poem is actually for next week, right?
Yeah, I'm actually discussing all these poems, not because we're not having a lecture next week, so I'm kind of doing all of them today, right? Yeah. So if you haven't read those, don't worry. I'm giving you a preview.
Thank you.
Okay. So another strange antithesis or paradox that you find just as, finding light in darkness is kind of paradoxical. Here, Young says, how populous, how vital is the grave? What does he mean by that? And why is that a paradoxical statement? When he comes to the grave, he finds it vital and populous.
Because it's the one part of life that everyone shares, regardless of station, that everyone is going to end up there. And so it's quite populous.
It's quite populous, yes. But he also calls it vital, which is really strange. Vital being like full of life.
I think he's trying to like detach the general human fear associated with death. It's like he's trying to detach it, make it a lot less personal, and then in turn trying to see like the more truth and the reality for what it is, rather than whatever his emotions and what his immediate human impulses lead him to think.
Good. But
it could also just, thinking about the grave could lead you to thinking about like making a to-do list before you end up there, knowing that you're all, you're going to be there at some point.
I think, Christy, that's a good connection to the word vital. Like, how vital is the grave if you aren't aware of death and the necessity? I can't remember which poem. I think it might have been Young that was talking about how people have a tendency to procrastinate.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been digging through Blair's grave for the last like 2-3 days, so I'm kind of exhausted. But I remember reading Young's Night Thoughts, and I was just inspired. It just felt like an inspirational speech to me. And
yeah. I've been reading a lot in the last couple of days about how so many of these writers were also clergymen of various faiths, and how that reflected on their what they were writing, and that in some cases it seemed questionable whether they were actually just kind of spun out from a sermon that they were going to give.
That was what I kept focusing on, especially this week. I almost couldn't get away from that. So I mean, so then I kept thinking, like when you said about how populous, how vital is the grave, this idea of it's a stepping stone to the afterlife, if you're looking at it from that perspective. So how vital in the sense of that it's not the end of something, it's the beginning of something.
Very good. Yes. Yeah. It's not terminal. And you're right. A lot of these poets had a vocation in the church, in the clergy. And that's partly because those are, those are the literate people in that society for the most part. A person learned in poetry and in different meter and in Latin and Greek, because you will be taking orders to go into the clergy, but you'll also be equipped to be a poet. It's really funny that that's not an association we might make these days, because everyone's kind of equally miseducated. I'm just kidding. No,
Even the like educational structure as we know it.
I'm joking. We're all teachers here, so yeah, I was totally joking.
Like the educational structure as we know it is like late 19th century, and it's Germanic. So it's like these guys have been, they're not going to classes. They're educated by governesses, or they're educated by like people specifically on those elements.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good. I also think vital is probably it's vital in the sense that it's alive with visions, because it's giving him these visions. It's populating his mind with ghosts, apparitions, angels, activity, thoughts. So it's alive in that way. It's
So at this point in time too, was it that mostly the clergymen were seen as the kind of wise people that would, like, the ones that people would go to in order to kind of get answers?
They were the educated upper classes. I mean, usually, I'm sure there's plenty of stories of less people from less means who were gifted in reading, writing, and just smart, and they had the wherewithal to get into get into Oxford or something and become a clergyman. But I think for the most part, these were, I mean, that part of that this history, I'm not completely an expert on or anything, but this is kind of the sense I get. It would be kind of like, again, I don't want to make any political statements or anything, but it'd be kind of like how most academics are not from the working classes today, So yeah, that's a problem. I mean, I think that's unfortunate, tied to the church. I mean, think about it. Like there's a book I think called like How the Irish or How the Scottish, one or the other, Saved Civilization. It was a book, maybe came out 10 or 20 years ago, and it's about how all of Europe was pretty much illiterate after the fall of Rome, except for those few Irish monks who lived out in the middle of like these distant islands in the Hebrides or whatever, remote islands where they just sat around and transcribed the Gospels. Have you seen the Book of Kells? These illuminated manuscripts from the Dark Ages, which doesn't seem very dark when you look at the Book of Kells, because they're beautiful and beyond much of things we can fathom these days. They're just beautiful, and they're so that's where learning and literacy was situated for many hundreds of years.
Can I add a little point
in the church? Yes.
Yeah, so when I was in Ireland, they had an exhibit at the National Irish Museum where they had Buddhist, Muslim, and Christian texts spanning over the course of some 800 years. And all were basically variations of the Book of Kells. And the Book of Kells is like the most famous one. But what you end up noticing is that when you go through basically the timelines, the older the texts are, the more primitive the illustrations are. Because so many people were illiterate, the illustrations and the beauty of the text was a very big tool in terms of conversion. And so you have the Book of Kells, which is this massive and beautiful, and you're showing it to a bunch of illiterate people, and they're like, "Look how beautiful this is! God created this book, and it helps convert significantly more people." And then when you get to more Islamic texts and Muslim texts, which are much more recent comparatively, with hundreds of years of those illustrations, they're much more intricate in terms of the way that they've created those drawings and the illustrations. It's so cool to see.
Yeah. Well, that's also true of the cathedrals themselves and the stained glass. They wanted to create this awe-inspiring environment, and the stained glass themselves. I know we're getting a little bit off track, but the stained glass themselves, like they told stories. It was pictographical stories for illiterate people, telling the stories of the Gospels in the stained glass and on the walls. In Muslim culture, I spent a few years in different Muslim countries, and yeah, it's intricate pattern wise, but there's no images, there's no faces, visages, because they are iconoclastic. They're against graven images, part of their culture. So anyway, different perspectives on spirituality. All right, sorry, we've done a number of tangents, but let's proceed. Okay, I can't even remember where we were at, but we'll just go ahead and read and see what happens. Start up alarmed, and o'er life's narrow verge look down on what? A fathomless abyss, a dread eternity. How surely mine? And can eternity belong to me, poor pensioner on the bounties of an hour? How poor, how rich, how abject, how august, how complicate, how wonderful is man. How passing wonder he who made him such. Oh, what a miracle to man is man, triumphantly distressed, what joy, what dread, who centered in our make such strange extremes, from different natures marvelously mixed, connection exquisite of different worlds, distinguished link in being's endless chain. Being's endless chain, where'd you get that? Midway from nothing to deity, a beam ethereal, sullied, and absorbed. So here still we see the influence of Pope, right? The great chain of being. Not just that, but the man is kind of at a midpoint. He's the reconciliation of opposites, of opposite tendencies. Man being, halfway between worm or non-existence itself and the divine. He's the midway point. Okay, starting I woke and found myself undone. Where now my frenzy pompous furniture, the cobwebbed cottage with its ragged wall of moldering mud, is royalty to me. So suddenly, a ragged wall of moldering mud is royalty to me. The spider's most attenuated thread, its cord is cable to a man's tender tie on earthly bliss. It breaks at every breeze, ye blessed scenes of permanent delight, full above measure, lasting beyond bound. A perpetuity of bliss is bliss. Could you so rich in rapture, fear and end, that ghastly thought would drink up all your joy, and quite unparadise the realms of light. Okay. I know it's kind of hard because I'm jumping ahead in the poem, but what do you think is going on here? If you can read, he's kind of waking up from his reverie, his dream, his fantasy. And what has he learned in this vision he's had?
Well, that everything is something, if that makes sense. Like that everything, the way because I breezed through these earlier this week to kind of try to get everything tied together. And I kept finding the same thing, in that it's almost like this, everything has been created, it's by the creator, and so everything is beautiful, and everything is this, like, the cobweb cottage with its ragged wall is royalty. Like, it's I can't explain
that,
it,
right? No,
right?
that's great. That's great. No, I mean, think about it. Like, when these graveyard poets look at the grave as this great leveler, in which the pomp of office and high estate of kings is turned to nothing. Remember Ozymandias from last week. There is a great leveling, but that leveling actually applies to the waking as well. Like, through the influence of the perspective you get in night or in death or in winter or in graveyards, that when you're in touch with that kind of darker side, you see that it gets kind of Buddhist sounding or cheesy, but like that it's all connected, or that life is just this rich experience regardless of whether you're a pauper or a prince. And the king loses some of his luster, and you can see beauty in a cobweb. You can see beauty in a ramshackle hovel or whatever. And of course, and I hope you're all kind of getting where I'm going with some of this, because this is all leading towards Romanticism, and Wordsworth would take all these sentiments and really run with them. And they learned so much from the graveyard poets.
It seems like he's also grappling really heavily with this idea of the infinitude and like finiteness. And he uses this language which talks about like things being endless. And I know like the Romantic poets, they try to swim more into the infinite of the mind. Like, so he's trying to explore the finality of death, the infiniteness of heaven, the infiniteness of God. And then the Romantics take that up and then basically make a God out of the mind and say like, hey, look, the mind is now infinite.
Right. That's good. That's good. The kind of idea of going into your mind and the infinity, because it's all a part of the imagination. The imagination gives you for the romantics, the imagination gives you an entree into infinity, because you can't stop. There's no barriers anymore. You can just think of anything, right? So this is not Robert Blair. That is William Blake. A lot of people have been confused because any Google image search will give you pictures of William Blake and not Robert Blair. I actually couldn't find any pictures of Robert Blair. There's pictures of his son and there's pictures of William Blake. Why are there pictures of William Blake in Robert Blair's under a search? Well, because he's much more famous than Robert Blair, and he illustrated Robert Blair. I'm going to go back. See, these illustrations from Young are William Blake. I don't know if you recognize the style, but he's a poet in his own right, obviously from the time period. Kind of really a stepping stone from the 18th century poets to the 19th century Romantic poets was William Blake.
I was reading something about this in, doing some of my own research about this. And now is it correct that William Blake kind of interpreted some of the poem for the illustrations that weren't necessarily maybe what Robert Blair was intending?
That's a good question. I'm sorry I laughed, but that's just William Blake in a nutshell. I mean, in the sense that, look at the image he produced. There's no line in Blair that's like, and then the guy did a somersault over the skeleton. It's not there. Like, William Blake is just this, a creative genius, and he comes up with these insane pictures. And so it's kind of like one of these things, like you commission an artist to illustrate your children's story that you wrote, and then it ends up looking like, a Geiger print or something. Like, it's like totally not.
And I read somewhere that he had these very kind of subtle digs at Robert Blair by like intentionally misinterpreting something because he knew no one would call him out on it. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with this.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Awesome.
It was kind of, and then I was like, what am I have a full-time job and 2 kids and I'm doing this. Why am I like going?
Are you writing your weekly post on this? Because I want to find this and read this. This sounds so interesting.
Maybe I'll do another one and go back to this one because it was fascinating.
I'm a fan of Blake, and I have like actually, I used to work at the Huntington Library. Do you know the Huntington Library in San Marino in LA? And they have the original Blake etchings, hand painted. They're originals anyway. Let's get going a little bit far. We're kind of, so anyway, this is another illustration of the grave. And yet another one. So he did take some liberties. Let's move to Thomas Gray. And people have asked what, when you're thinking in terms of an elegy, you usually have an object, someone who has died, to eulogize. And people have said, well, who's he writing about? What was his name? And you can go through the elegy and he never names a person. But of course, it's about the dead. And these dead are nameless people. They are, that's, you could see the point I'm making, the anonymity of the dead in this poem. is part of the effect that the poem gives. Because if you said this elegy is, to Jonathan Smith or something, it wouldn't have the effect because there's something haunting about it. The way it haunts is through absence and anonymity, because when you don't have a specific individual that you're eulogizing, it becomes therefore almost a universal. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. And again, we get to like that sentiment that goes all the way back to Parnell and Pope, but specifically Parnell, that sense of leveling. Let not ambition mock means, just because you're some great person, a governor or a magistrate, don't look down upon them. The boasts of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. So why should you not mock this simple soul, this nameless pauper in his grave? Well, because as great as you think you are, you too will end up there someday. And like Ozymandias, even your brilliant monument will also decompose at some point. He has an epitaph, and it's, the name of the poem is Elegy, but it also contains an epitaph. What's the difference between an epitaph and an elegy? An epitaph is what's written on the actual tombstone. No farther seek his merits to disclose or draw his frailties from their dread abode. They are alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God. Did anyone kind of savor or reflect upon this epitaph and want to say anything about it?
I was thinking, especially with this poem, I kept thinking about how interesting it was to me that in this time frame, so many people, you were kind of relegated to the station you were born in, that there wasn't a lot of upward mobility, there wasn't a lot of movement in that way. And so I found it really interesting that a lot of these poems we read was basically of, I couldn't quite pinpoint if it was like an actual calling out of not judging people for the station they're at, or more simply that idea of like, don't question God, he put people where they're supposed to be, and so stop, like, which also keeps people where they're supposed to be. Right, so
right. Yeah,
I kept thinking that in reading all of these. I kept thinking, like, at first, like, what a beautiful thought, and then part of me was like, but
yeah, like most sentiments, there's a downside. I mean, you can say, well, I look forward to my reward in the afterlife.
Yeah, and these are not paupers that are writing these. These are not people who are living hard.
Right.
Not to say they're not living hard lives, but you know what I mean. They're from a place up here talking about them and everybody below them.
Right. I mean, you know,
it might be too contemporary of a view that I have reading it.
Yeah.
I like what you pointed out, that contradictory nature, because Nietzsche even responded directly to this when he started to kind of pose his, like, thus spoke Zarathustra and all that, where his big poem or his big problem with Christianity, Buddhism, is it was like anti-life, right? That people are not living their life for the sake of living their life. They're living their life to die. And then there's some great awakening. So they're ignoring everything that is happening now. So I think there's like a lot of contradictions between all those philosophies. But,
right. I mean, my criticism would kind of go along Nietzsche's. I mean, not that I'm talking about in terms of poetry. I'm not going to make any theological statements, but like the sense, there's a sentiment of like, hey, look forward to the afterlife, don't worry about it, man, you'll be happy with God. That was actually, you know, that could be used to keep black slaves down in the South or whatever, in, you know, in the 19th century. They were very fervent in their Christian beliefs, and some people have, you know, maybe pointed out that that was probably a way to keep them from actually revolting from their station.
Yeah,
But
Frederick
you can
Douglass.
apply that not just to that particular situation, but in Nietzsche would say that we're all like that. Like, you know, if when you look for your reward in the afterlife, it kind of settles your ambition. It kind of keeps you tame or something. Like he used, I think that's the word he would use. It tames you, tames the lion spirit, something like that. Paul, yeah.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass had really heavy criticism, and he made a distinction between like the Christianity of the South and good Christianity, because even he was a slave and he hated the way Southern Christians practiced, but he was still a Christian. And kind of making that connection to graveyard poetry, it almost seems like it seems like a lot of these poets are trying to like basically do a correcting lens for how to view death for good Christians. Like it's like there are ways, like maybe they would respond to Nietzsche and say, you know, you're looking at it the wrong way. And I think the evidence for that would definitely be the constant observations of nature, that they're appreciating the dead leaves, they're appreciating the dead trees, they're appreciating what they have, and using it to affirm the beauty of life, not to glorify heaven, but to affirm what they have.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, and to say like so much of what we read this week, I don't have it in front of me to say an exact line, but was the idea that on a positive note, that everyone will be worthy of the reward of an afterlife, regardless of bad choices, bad decisions, or station in life. That as long as you know, do your best to be your best, I guess, then like that it's not something that's just merely reserved for higher society or the aristocracy.
Right.
That's the positive spin.
That is the positive spin. You're right. I think that's what Paul was saying. Yeah. So, yeah, I know that Cooper, I keep wanting to call him Cowper, but it's Cooper, the British pronunciation of that poet. Cooper, I know, chimed in on the slavery issue. I actually don't reference it in this lecture, but anyway, one quick thing. We actually probably should wrap it up. We're kind of hitting the top of the hour. We actually are at the top of the hour, but I will try to. If you have to go, that's fine. But I'm going to try to, maybe in the next 5 or 10 minutes, try to bring this to a conclusion. So Wordsworth. This is William Wordsworth. He's the probably one of the key founders of the Romanticism, and he was a huge fan of the graveyard poets in general, and he wrote quite a bit about epitaphs. And actually, when we are at the top of the hour, I was going to kind of go into this a little bit, and as you can see, it's slightly dense, but just to summarize, and I'm not going to read it, but just to summarize, he had a problem with epitaphs. Alexander Pope actually wrote epitaphs, and his epitaphs were much like his poetry. They were a little bit show-offy, and very, they had that Popian heroic couplets, and Wordsworth accused Pope of thinking more about his own performance as a poet in writing the epitaph than in trying to convey the character or the nature of the person who the epitaph was being written for. And so Wordsworth said that when you write an epitaph, you're embodying someone, but you are trying to portray them as a tree through a tender haze or luminous mist, which is what's in red there, that spiritualizes and beautifies it. So if you think about like Pope, he being a product of the Enlightenment, he was trying to be very precise. And as the Enlightenment was one of its key kind of calling cards was empiricism. They wanted to be kind of accurate. Romanticism and graveyard poetry allows people to be not so accurate. You're seeing the tree that you're trying to depict, not through a microscope, which would be, in scientific terms, maybe a more accurate view of said tree, but you're seeing the tree through a mist. Why is seeing, and this is a metaphor for an epitaph, why is seeing a tree through a mist a better way of seeing a tree than looking at a leaf through a microscope? Why would seeing a leaf through a mist or a tree through a mist give one almost more insight than simply seeing that leaf or tree through a telescope or microscope? Any ideas about that?
I think you can come to it through other senses than simply the five that we think of. You know, it's not something that you necessarily see or hear or can touch or or quantify. It's a general sense that you experience of the person, dead person or whatever, and to bring a sense of who they were as a whole rather than as individual parts of them or individual traits of the character.
Right. That's exactly right. What Wordsworth is saying here, when you kind of dig into the metaphor, is that the mist in this metaphor that the tree is being seen through is the artifice that the writer brings, so that it's what the artist brings to the picture. Just like when you try to reflect on the passing of a loved one, you have to consider what everyone else thought about that person and the love that they had for that person. And if you take that out of the picture, and if you just say, here lies John Smith, he went to school at the University of Virginia and he got a job working in finance and he died in 2019, or you just state the brute facts of his life. Does that really give a good image? Or it's accurate, but what Wordsworth is trying to say is a real epitaph will give more and bring the tender haze, which is what he calls the kind of the artificial thing that a poet can bring, that spiritualizes the person through art. Okay, and this was a very influential essay, and Wordsworth. This is like another one of those bridges, very, very interesting and key bridges between the graveyard poets and Romanticism. Is this particular essay? Okay, just thought I'd point that out. And like I said, I was going to get into reading certain epitaphs that were evidence or examples of what Wordsworth is talking about. This is Jane Austen's epitaph. So you can, like I said, I'll put this online. We don't have time to read these epitaphs now. Well, maybe I will. You guys have a few seconds? Okay. There's a few lines that says, this is Jane Austen, the benevolence of her heart, the sweetness. It's got that F for S that they did back then. The sweetness of her temper and the extraordinary endowments of her mind obtained the regard of all who knew her and the warmest love of her intimate connections. Their grief, see, the people who love her are part of this epitaph. Their grief is in proportion to their affection. They know their loss to be irreparable, but in their deepest affliction, they are consoled by a firm, though humble hope that her charity, devotion, and faith and purity have rendered her soul acceptable in the sight of her Redeemer. It's very confusing because the F in firm is actually an F and not an S. So anyway, those 18th century fonts drive me crazy sometimes. But so anyway, you can see that this is kind of an example of the Wordsworthian epitaval principle, that it's not just about this person who lived and died and the basic brute facts of her life. It's they're trying to spiritualize her through adding in a little bit of artifice by talking about the effect she had on others.
I have a quick question, a writing question, actually. I like to use the word like realistic and expressionistic quite frequently with the writing, and I do with high school kids all the time, but it doesn't matter. You know, when it comes to like your view as a professor, and we're talking about like not necessarily the physical reality, but more like the emotional reality, do you think using like the painting term expressionistic is like appropriate for writing about things like this?
Like expressionistic, yeah, maybe. I mean, people might confuse it with the expressionist painters that were from a different time period, from like a century later or so. It's sad because a lot of ists and isms now have multiple meanings, like romanticism, for instance. You know, if you could Google like, is Jane Austen a romantic writer? In some ways, she doesn't have a lot of the romanticist characteristics of Byron Keats and Shelley and Mary Shelley and some of these more Gothic type figures. But her novels were very romantic, and they did. You know, she's a really big fan of Cooper. So I'm sorry, a little bit of a digression, but you asked about expressionism. Yeah, it expresses, it's expressionistic or impressionistic in some ways, not to be confused with the actual capital I impressionism, capital E expressionism of the respective artistic movements from the next century. Okay. Oh gosh, now we're going to talk about Cooper. We're going on so long. All right. I wanted to, so this is from next week, but it's a great poem. It's Cooper's The Task. It was originally a task that was given to him to write the task by a friend. And she challenged him to write an epic poem about a sofa. So the poem starts out in a very strange way. And it starts out almost, you think that it's not serious because it's very satirical. And again, there's elements of Pope because Pope wrote Rape of the Lock, which is mock heroic and mock epic. And Cooper is definitely in the mock heroic vein when he talks about his sofa. I sing the sofa, I who lately sang truth, hope, and charity, and touched with awe the solemn chords with a trembling hand. This is blank verse, echoes of Milton. Singing the sofa to sing. When you talk about singing in the first few lines of an epic poem, it's that goes back to the Iliad. Milton said, I sing. He's asking the muse to sing of man's first disobedience. Virgil's first few lines in Latin translated is, of arms and a man I sing. And Achilles' wrath in the Iliad, heavenly goddess sing. So he's working within that tradition. Okay, I need to. You can kind of look at some of these on your own. I need to bring this to a close. I actually have another prior engagement, but so you will be looking next week at the task. He has a letter to Joseph Hill that you can look at. And like I said, I'll post this so you can kind of go through some of these slides more more closely. These are some interesting, interesting stanzas from the task. This one in particular. Creating what I saw. That's the, he's referring to his imagination. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these. In what ways did the graveyard poets of the 18th century set the stage for Romanticism in the Gothic? Imagination over reason, emotion over intellect, the unknown over the known or science, nature, the appreciation of nature, what nature can teach us, experiencing nature firsthand rather than through a microscope or a laboratory. Dark imagery, of course, and the self, which consists of introspection, subjective truth as opposed to objective truth that you get again through kind of enlightenment, empiricism, and the imagination. These are kind of self-oriented, subjective frames of mind. Okay, so thank you very much. Sorry that went a lot overboard, just about almost 15 minutes over, but thanks for sticking with me. And I'll be available for emails for questions, but keep up the good work. You guys have been great. If there's any other questions. No.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.